What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's Best Bets episode for UFC Baku Rafael Fiziev versus Manuel Torres, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. Starting off with the most confident picks, we got Nazim Sadikov, Abdul Rahman, and Daniel Donchenko. Let's start off with Nazim Sadikov versus Matheus Camilo. I think this fight comes down to whether Camilo can consistently get this fight to the ground, because if he can't, I favor Nazim Sadikov heavily in the striking exchanges. Nazim, I feel like he's reached a point in his career where he's fully matured. All the experiences, all the tough fights, all the setbacks he's had, I feel like they should be starting to pay off at this point in his career. He's become a much more polished and complete fighter. Where I can't say the same for Camilo. Camilo, he still feels like a prospect who is developing and figuring things out in the UFC level. Camilo's coming off of a nice win over Vyacheslav Borsov, but Nazim is a completely different challenge. He brings far more pressure, power, and just overall danger. Even in his loss to Fares Yam is a tough challenge for everyone using his height and length. Matheus Camilo is not going to present those same problems here. And stylistically, I like Nazim here because the physical dimensions versus him and Matheus Camilo, they're very similar. Camilo, he won't have the size or the range advantages that can create problems for Nazim, which should allow Nazim to fight at his preferred distance and pace, right? On the feet, Nazim is one of the most dangerous strikers in the division. He mixes things together really well. His powerful boxing combinations, body kicks, clinch, elbows, and relentless pressure. He has a knack for hurting opponents and creating big moments throughout the fight. For Camilo, I feel like the smartest approach would be to wrestle, right? If he can chain wrestle and get those chain takedowns together and force extended grappling exchanges, he does have a path to victory here. But I trust Nazim's strength and his experience and takedown defense to keep the fight standing often enough to make the difference, right? Plus, he's fighting in his hometown. He's more motivated than ever to get a win coming off of a loss in his hometown. And I just think Nazim Sadikov in this matchup, he's going to have the better striking, the more power, and enough takedown defense to keep this fight where he's the most dangerous, right? So moving on to Abdul Rahman Yakiayev versus Julius Walker. Listen, I'm going to keep backing Abdul Rahman until someone gives me a reason not to. He's young, undefeated, hungry, and has looked dominant in every single fight we have seen him in. Whether it's on the feet or it's on the ground, he finds a way to finish fights. And right now, he looks like a prospect that's simply operating on a different level than the opponents being put in front of him right now. Julius Walker hasn't shown enough for me to believe he's the guy who hands Abdul Rahman his first loss. Walker is 1-2 in the UFC, and while he has had some competitive moments, his resume doesn't compare to the momentum and upside that Abdul Rahman is bringing into this matchup, right? What stands out most about Abdul Rahman is how complete he looks. He has knockout power, submission ability, strong wrestling, and he doesn't appear to have any glaring weaknesses as of yet. He's finishing fights quickly, but he's also shown in his career that he can go deeper in fights when it's necessary. So questions about his cardio or toughness, it really doesn't concern me here. Walker will likely look to make this grappling heavy fight, but I don't see that working out in his favor. If anything, I think Abdul Rahman is the better wrestler and more dangerous overall as a fighter in those grappling exchanges, especially. So at this point, it feels like Abdul Rahman is going to keep running through these opponents until UFC gives him a legitimate step up in competition. So I just think he's the more complete fighter, more dangerous, and simply levels above in every area. So moving on to Daniel Donchenko versus Theodore Berger. I'm not sure. Look, this is a very difficult spot for Theodore Berger. Not only is he making his UFC debut on short notice, but he's doing it against a dangerous and experienced striker in Daniel Donchenko. Donchenko is a type of fighter who can make life miserable for anyone on the feet. He's aggressive, technical, and consistently looking to inflict damage with combinations, kicks, elbows, and creative attacks. If this fight stays standing for any significant amount of time, I expect Donchenko to have a major advantage here. Berger deserves the credit for his toughness. He's never been knocked out before. And generally, he likes to pressure forward, mix in the wrestling, and make the fights gritty. Realistically, That's probably his clearest path to victory here. He needs to close the distance, force some takedowns, and try to turn this into a grappling heavy fight. The problem is pulling off that game plan is difficult under normal circumstances and even harder on short notice. Questions about his conditioning, preparation time, and overall UFC level experience make it tough to trust Theodore Berger in this matchup. I expect Donchenko to take control of the center of the octagon, dictate the striking exchanges, and gradually wear Berger down with volume and damage. Even if Berger shows his usual durability, Donchenko should be landing cleaner and more impactful shots throughout the fight. So I'm picking Daniel Donchenko to have the superior striking with better preparation and a significant experience advantage. It should carry him to a victory here. So let's move on to lock of the week. Lock of the week, Shara Bullet Magomedov. I think this is a very favorable matchup for Shara Bullet. If this fight plays out mostly on the feet, which I expect it to, Shara should have a clear advantage in the striking exchanges. Pereira, he just doesn't look like the same fighter he was a few years ago. He struggled badly against quality competition, losing multiple fights in convincing fashion, and even in his recent win over Zachary Reese, he didn't look particularly sharp. It feels like the explosiveness and unpredictability that once made him so dangerous, they have started to fade. Shara has had some setbacks himself. He was pushed hard in his last fight versus Marc-Andre Barriault and lost a striking battle to Michael Venom Page, but there's no shame in losing to Michael Venom Page, one of the best pure strikers in the sport right now. Outside of that, Shara has consistently shown that he's a dangerous and highly skilled kickboxer. Stylistically, I think Shara is the more technical fighter. He switches stances really well, throws a wide variety of kicks, uses his range really effectively, and does a great job breaking opponents down over time. His calf kicks, knees, and straight punches, they should be the key weapons here in this fight. I expect Shara to keep this fight at range, attack Pereira's legs, slow his movement down, and gradually uh taking over the striking exchanges, right? Whether Pereira comes forward aggressively or tries to fight a more measured fight, I think Shara has the tools to stay composed and pick him apart. Shara Magomedov, I expect him to have the superior technique, the cleaner striking, and just better overall form. It should lead him to a victory here in his hometown, let's call it. The guys are going to be rooting for him. So moving on to underdog of the week. Underdog of the week, Manuel Torres versus Rafael Fiziev. Look, I know a lot of people are backing Rafael Fiziev here, but I'm actually leaning towards Manuel Torres. And it's not because I think Fiziev is overrated. He's an elite striker with great technique, speed, and experience, but I think Torres brings a level of explosiveness and finishing ability that makes him incredibly dangerous in this matchup. Torres has looked phenomenal lately. He's finishing quality opponents, stuffing takedowns, and carrying fight-changing power in every exchange. In every striking exchange, right? Whether it's Grant Dawson, Drew Dober, or Nicholas Moda, he's shown that if he lands, he can end the fight instantly. To Fiziev's credit, he's been fighting a much higher level of competition. He shared the cage with names like Justin Gaethje, Mateus Gamrot, Mauricio Rufy, and he has the skills to make this fight competitive. He's a patient striker who can attack from range, work the legs and body, and counter opponents as they move forward. The question for me is whether he can avoid the big shot for 15 minutes. Torres is aggressive, powerful, and seems to have real killer instinct when he hurts opponents. Even if Fiziev is winning portions of the fight with technique and movement, Torres only needs one opening to completely change the momentum. I expect Fiziev to have success early on in this matchup, using his footwork, his kicks, and technical striking to score points. But the longer the fight goes, the more I trust Torres to find a clean shot and create one of those explosive moments he's become known for, right? So I'm picking Manuel Torres to have that elite power in this matchup. He has the dangerous finishing instincts and the ability to turn a competitive fight into a knockout at any moment, right? So let's move on to the parlay section where we got, starting off with the safety lock at minus 180, Shara and Donchenko. This parlay is built around two fighters who should have clear striking advantages. Shara is the more technical and dangerous striker against Pereira, while Donchenko, he gets a short notice opponent making his UFC debut. Both should be able to control the range, land cleaner shots, and dictate where this fight takes place. Now, moving on to the ultimate lock, Shara and Nazim at -120. Shara gives you elite kickboxing and range management, while Nazim, he brings the pressure, the power, and the experience. Nazim's path is simple: keep the fight standing, defend the takedowns, and force Camilo into striking exchanges. If both fights play out where these guys are the strongest, this ticket looks really solid, right? So now moving on to the affordable juice section, Javier Reyes and Asu Almabayev +140. Reyes is one of the most intriguing prospects in the card, and he has shown strong finishing ability early on in his UFC run. He has the height and reach and the power over his opponent, Khan Ofli. And then you're looking at Asu Almabayev, who brings relentless pace, wrestling, and cardio. You're getting plus money while backing two fighters who should be able to impose their preferred style on their opponents, right? So now moving on to the four most confident picks: Shara, Donchenko, Nazim, and Abdul Rockman for +160. This is your core confidence parlay. Shara, he's the superior striker in his matchup. Donchenko, massive experience and preparation advantage. And Nazim, the harder hitter with more proven fight experience, right? And then you're looking at Abdul Rockman, undefeated prospect who looks like he's levels above the competition he's facing. All four have clear stylistic advantages and multiple ways to win. And then moving on to the fun duo parlay. Farman and Ikram at +110. Farman, he's getting the hometown debut spot and enters with a lot of momentum behind him. I don't think his opponent is really a big step up in competition or anything. And then you're looking at Ikram. He remains one of the most dangerous and complete middleweights outside of the rankings. This is a fun parlay built around two fighters who can dominate with pressure, wrestling, and finishing ability, and using their power, right? Then you're looking at Underdog City Sprinkle. I went crazy with the Underdog City Sprinkle this week because I picked a good amount of underdogs, and these are the ones I really believe are going to come through. Manuel Torres, Andre Puliev, Michael Olenjacek, and Beksat Almakhan at +2,275 for an underdog sprinkle. This is the lottery ticket. Manuel Torres, he holds the power to completely change the fight with one punch, and I do believe he'll land that shot. Puliev, he has the physical tools to pull off an upset. He's composed and he has good underrated striking against someone who is known to be good for using his height and reach, which is completely neutralized because Puliev is going to bring in his own height and reach in this matchup, right? And then you're looking at Olenjacek, who always carries knockout potential, and he just shown he can go the distance in his last fight, right? And then you're looking at Beksat Almakhan, who's looked like a dangerous prospect from the moment he entered the UFC. His two losses are to high-level fighters, and I do believe his opponent, Gene Matsumoto, is a really hittable fighter, right? So none of these are guaranteed, but they all have realistic paths to pulling off surprises, and then pulling them all off together, it's a lottery ticket, right? So that does conclude this week's best bets for UFC Baku Rafael Fiziev versus Manuel Torres. Hope you guys found this helpful. Till next time, peace.